Welcome. Thank you so much for attending tonight's city conversation on the way we work. It is sponsored by the Happel Foundation. I am the secretary of the foundation, and quite a number of the trustees are with us today. Celia, who is the chair of today's conversation, is also a trustee. The Happel Foundation is a registered charity founded by Ted Happold and the founding partners of Bureau Happold. It continues to be funded by the partnership, allowing us to deliver our aims to raise the profile of engineering in the built environment and leverage engineering thinking to have a positive impact on the world. This is done through 4 themes: engineering futures, which reaches out to young students in primary to secondary school, engineering education, which is our undergraduate program, and supporting excellence in teaching. Our thinking program, which is what the conversation sits under, which is on public realm discussions, and engineering human development, which reaches out to tackle some of the issues of today and provide equality, global equality. And the conversations are produced by the Happel Foundation with Ingenuity Limited and supported when we get together face to face by the Built Environment Trust. Pass on to Celia.
Welcome everyone. Just like to introduce and welcome our panelists. So we've got panelists for a range of backgrounds to give us a variety of insights into this multifaceted situation. We've got expertise in planning, transport, urban geography, workplaces and architecture. I think Andrew's going to share a link to their individual bios on the through the chat box, but essentially we've got Helen Page, who's a technical coordinator at Price and Myers. We've got Chiara Tagliaro, who's an architect and currently a research fellow, and we've got Dr. Greg Marsden, who's a professor of transport governance at the Institute of Transport Studies at the University of Leeds. We've got Professor Henry Way, who's a professor of geography at James Madison University in Virginia in the US. And we've got, so I'm scrolling down my list to make sure I don't miss anyone. We've got Tim Hurstwin, who's a former commercial director of expedition engineering and has just changed sides. So he'll have some interesting perspectives from that. And we've also got Richard Simmons joining us as well, who's, I'm just trying to find your yeah, he's coming more from a town planning and urban designer perspective. So I guess I just wanted to start by saying I'm sorry for mixing my metaphors, but I know that for many of us this year has been a car crash that's turned into an endurance marathon. And it's challenged all of us on many levels. And this conversation is really focusing on the workplace, as it's a realm that's been significantly affected. And there are some aspects that have been talked about and that we're going to touch on today, including things like the role of the workplace, you know, the social dimension, the fact that it's a place for creative interactions, that it's kind of a pull hub for things like travel and transport. Its physical location is part of local economies, and you know, considering the fate of things like co-located cafes and coffee shops, for example, in our city centres. It's also raised the question of what do we really value in our built environment. You know, we're spending more time in different parts of it, and suddenly things like access to parks and green spaces are becoming a lot more important to us. Things like those incidental interactions in small shops are becoming quite significant, and we're perhaps moving more slowly through spaces as we walk and cycle more rather than using public transport, or doing blind vehicle commutes. And I think there's a bit of perhaps moving the focus of our awareness a bit closer to home. For those of us who are architects or engineers, we might be actually looking more at our local built environment than some more remote places, perhaps for the first time. And I also wanted to raise the issue of some of these gendered impacts, as more and more we're thinking about things like, how can city design support caregivers or level the playing field a bit, thinking about the kind of imbalance there often is between male and female caregiving and working from home practices. So those are just some triggers for thought. And I'm going to hand it over to our panelists now. And we're going to start off with Chiara, I think.
Thank you for the invite, first of all, and for this interesting introduction. So I would like to share with you today some of the reflections that I made about what I called, together with my colleagues, COVID working. So this new practice that we all dislike, but that to some extent I believe can give us some hints for our future lives and way of working. I was very inspired by an experiment by Bloomberg City Lab that basically asked their readers to draw some maps of their lives during the pandemic. This happened in April. And basically what came up is a wonderful collection, I think, of new journeys through everyday lives that involve all the senses. So for instance, in this case, but in others as well, people started observing the different prints that are left on the ground by different activities and by different humans, the activities of the humans, but also other living creatures during their different days. And people also started to basically rediscover sounds and to draw these sounds as very colorful concerts. So to discover very complex structure of that involve all the senses throughout the day. And people started exploring their neighborhoods in different ways. So rather than taking the usual routes to go to work, they were sort of strolling around all the streets and and discovering the alternative paths that they could take to go from A to B. And of course, as we all know, people started also to analyze better, I think, their homes and to find new activities that they could undertake there to rearrange their spaces and to experience and explore some flexible solutions to make the best out of their tiny spaces sometimes. So of course, all this happened because of very sad circumstances. And I mean, this, of course, we all wish that they don't repeat. But I think that if we all interpret this as a diversity experiment, we can apply a new resiliency in our future lives. How? I think by embracing hybridization. So basically, we reflected with some colleagues about the different layers of hybridization, and we found out that this has multiple meanings. We explored this in co-working spaces to find out that co-working spaces are spatially hybrid in the sense that they offer flexible layout, flexible furniture, and they overlap on top of different functions and existing buildings. They are temporally hybrid in the sense that they offer different activities throughout the day and sleep, as we saw in the drawing before. So something that is alive both during the day and during the night. They welcome a variety of different users that occupy the spaces in different ways. So think about how an office building could welcome theoretically not only one category of employees, but a multiplicity of people. In co-working spaces, spaces are also open to what we call the occasionality of presence. It means that access is not limited to one standard time, but accommodates multiple needs. In these spaces, also activities and functions are hybrid. You never know when a break area ends and when a workspace begins. The ways they are managed is usually, again, hybrid in the sense that it involves different stakeholders. Most of the time, the end users take some role, some responsibility in chores and services to other end users. And finally, these spaces are rarely only private, but most of the time they are permeable and they open up to the citizenship, basically, by offering services and activities that are publicly accessible. So basically, I kind of wish that this different levels of hybridization could expand beyond the limits of co-working spaces to other buildings also. They have been recently talking about empty office spaces in the Manhattan area and how they could be refunctionalized to host affordable housing. I think that this is a great chance to start experiment on this hybridization. So I think that they should not only be transformed into housing, but they could probably host gyms, storage spaces, perhaps green gardens on the rooftops, laundry rooms. They could offer spaces for learning activities, both for children and for elderly people and for adults. And they could really be designed more as services than as spaces. Someone said that we should reverse the motto space as a service into service as a space. And I kind of believe that this is true. The design driver should be that of serving the activities that people undertake and transform the spaces accordingly. So not only, I think designers should maybe become a little less specialized into building types, because I think that building types potentially as they are, as we know them, they could not exist anymore in the future. But they could be more specialized in accompanying the building through its evolution over time and work together with managers, with facility property managers, the people who manage the buildings, in order to help them combine and keep together all the elements that serve the family, the work, and the social life of people. So to conclude, I don't think that we should make the office great again, but that we should look forward and think for what functions and activities can come together and around the office. Thank you. This is my vision, and I hope that we can comment on that in soon.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I was going to add my thoughts then on the subject. So hopefully you can all see my screen. So I mean, I was starting off simply with the fact that I don't believe in a post-COVID world. I think what I believe in is we'll get to a point where we don't have to think about COVID every day in every action that we take. And every day we go through our lives with many risks that we don't consciously think about. But I think this will take some time. I think we've got another year ahead of us, even with the latest positive news on vaccine. And so we'll all have to come to learn to live with COVID, but also to work with it. And so there's been many changes to what work means over the last few hundred years. The first industrial revolution saw a decline in cottage industries and the birth of modern company law and the company-employee relationship as we know it today. The second industrial revolution, the technical revolution, saw mass standardization and product enhancements, which in turn led to improvements in living standards and the growth of leisure time. And then the third industrial revolution, the digital revolution, gave us the shift from analog to digital. This led to sort of less manual workforce and, importantly, recently, the portability of tech. But all these changes have been gradual, and in times like we're in now, where the climate emergency is widely accepted, we need to up our game and change quickly. So then along comes COVID, which I view as a positive thing, in that the ONS reported during the first lockdown that just under 50% of the UK workforce was working remotely, working from home. For some time, the innovators and early adopters have been challenging office presentism of desk-based working lives with the rise of coffee shop working and hot desking and co-working spaces. And the reason behind this are many, but for me, there's a fundamental truth that a single working environment does not fit the various types of work that we undertake nowadays. It's from screen-based to pen and paper, from hectic high-energy work to quiet focus. Different tasks benefit from different environments. So with COVID, we've been forced to carry out a large-scale experiment on how we shape our own working environment. So it was interesting, the Bloomberg piece there about people talking about shaping their homes, about how they worked. We've been running this experiment for a substantial amount of time now, and so society as a whole has managed to jump that chasm. And what we've seen is that even the laggards have been forced to try something different and a different way of engaging with the world of work. We found a great many positives from this experiment, but what we've seen as the biggest downside is the collaborative effectiveness has been hit, and also sort of mental well-being. And this comes from the very essence our very essence as human beings, to be a social species. And no one wishes to return to cubicle working, which easily remote working can become when we all sit in these little boxes on Zoom. Now, organisations have had a chance to take stock and reflect on how they arrange themselves and their workforces for everyone's benefit. Companies have survived this mass experiment, and many companies, it's given them a sort of the opportunity to learn that they can actually trust their employees, not to be at their desks. They can learn that people can be a lot more effective and productive outside the constraints of being chained to the 9 to 5. So how does this all go and affect our built environment and our cities? My basic prediction is uncontroversial, but there will be a significant portion of the workforce that continue to demand a high degree of flexibility in their working environments. And many companies, I think, will want to continue to offer this long after COVID's behind us. I don't believe there'll be a mass exodus from cities, which some people talk about, but I think there may be a slight change in the demographic. I think there'll be definitely changes on our transport systems. Some people choose to move further from cities, commute for longer, but for fewer days. But not all can do this, not all will want to do this. I mean, cities will still be a pool, as was already mentioned, for opportunities, whether they be career, cultural, or for personal relationships. What I think we'll see is traditional city centres will be challenged. If working patterns and travel patterns are more varied, then the need for your office to be sat on top of a transport hub falls away. Periphery areas will increase in attractiveness, and those are areas which traditionally have got more of a mix in them, but also there's commercial reality that companies are going to be offering offices which have a much lower occupancy rates, and so will seek to reduce their headline rents. But this, I think, is a positive because it will support momentum on the growth of 20-minute neighbourhoods where employment and retail and education and leisure and residencies and transport are all much closer mixed. And I think what we'll see in these sorts of areas is a much greater growth of third place working environments. So again, this is the coffee shops, the co-working spaces, so away from the distractions of home, but equally not requiring travel into city centres. The office buildings we have in our cities, this will mean the end of the single-use building, but this is a trend that's already underway. I think all COVID does is accelerate it. Buildings will need to offer a greater 24/7 use rather than sway to the city being ghost towns in the evenings and weekends. So a much greater mix of use to attract a greater mix of people to live, work and play. And this will mean greater flexibilities in floor plates, but also greater flexibility in leasing models that we have as landlords, and perhaps a greater degree of perpetual meanwhile users. So my vision for the future of the cities is bustling, but less packed rush hours, more deliberate workplaces where the purpose of coming together is core. We can now all sit in the desk anywhere in the world, so coming to the office has to offer something better than just staying at home. So the past year and the next year will give us all the chance to make an evolutionary jump in how and where we work, and I hope that we all embrace it. And now I think I'm going to pass over to Richard.
Thank you.
Yeah. There we go.
Just sharing my screen. There's obviously an acute danger with this kind of event that you will hear some repetition. So you may hear a bit of repetition in what I'm about to say. But I want to think about COVID-19 as an accelerant to change that's already happening, but argue that we need to be a bit more proactive than just watching from the sidelines as our cities evolve and change. And so my starting point, after long thought over many years, is why do we actually get together in cities? And I think there are two real reasons if you boil everything down. One is to exchange things, everything from products to genes to art and ideas, and resilience. Cities are very resilient places because of the investment that's been made in them. And they have to be resilient to enable that exchange to happen safely, if it's only the city wall that protects your market from the Viking raiders. But we need to remember that when exchange is broken, resilience fails too. So these two things are interlinked. This is obviously Detroit, as you'll realize, where the economy tanked because of changes in the world car market. And so we have to recognize that there is a very real risk that if we don't take steps to intervene when major crises hit the economy of our cities, then that can impact on their resilience. And I think that there was a shift from public health to personal medicine, which took place, this is Alexander Fleming with penicillin. This took place just around about the time of the Second World War. And previously, Hygeia on the left, admittedly it failed, but it was a community proposed in the 1820s in the USA to provide a hygienic living environment dealing with things like TB and so on. So planning used to be rooted in public health. But because we were given the opportunity through personal medicine to not worry about it any longer, planning has rather lost its way on the public health front. And meanwhile, because of our urbanization and our destruction of natural habitats and becoming closer and closer to species whose viruses we're not immune to, we have opened Pandora's box. The fact it wasn't actually a box and it wasn't Pandora who opened it doesn't really matter. That's the thing, is we have released upon ourselves the first of possibly a number of difficult pandemics. And so here we all are with our laptops on the ironing board, educating the kids at home. And obviously in one case here, somebody's on this call listening to what's going on. So we've all had to reconsider, certainly in the UK, as we're locked down, our working environment, as Tim has pointed out. And that has had a big impact on our central business districts. It's accelerated those structural change that's been taking place because people have already been starting to work from home. I do it myself. And people have actually found that their local shopping centre, their local town centre, may be the place they need to go when they're locked down. So as again, Tim and others have pointed out, we see a big impact on our central business districts. And this is something I think we need to respond to. I think just sitting there watching it happening and saying, what will the market do, is not going to be good enough. We also saw yesterday in the UK a report from the RAC of all people, the Royal Automobile Club, which said that attitudes to public transport have been set back by 2 decades by COVID-19. People are just nervous about traveling on public transport now, and they're going to use their cars much more in the future. And this is summarized. My brother, who is much younger than me and works for a large public broadcasting organization, which will remain nameless in the UK, wrote this letter, and it became the letter of the week in the New Statesman. And he basically says in this letter that he's been having a terrible time, 3 hours a day commuting, So what he's found is that working from home, he's more productive, he spends more time with his family, and he says he's never going back, even if things improve post-COVID. So I use my brother as evidence that things are going to go through some kind of structural change. But again, I say we can't just sit back and hope for the best, because Tim's talked about the information workers, the people who have choice. And here are the people at Microsoft sitting in their tree house, because Microsoft has been building tree houses. And you'll notice it's even been charred using the Shu Sugi Ban technique, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. But back in '94, Anderson said that our cities of the future are full of lights and shadows, because the information workers will grow wealthy. But the people in the Amazon warehouse, which didn't exist in '94, but now does, are not going to get the same benefits out of what's happening with COVID as maybe those who can work from home. You can't really work from home and be an Amazon worker, as my daughter's brother-in-law finds when he's working all the hours that God sends at the moment to keep us supplied with stuff. So there is a definitely distributional impact here that we mustn't forget, I think. So I think what we need to do is avoid wasting a good crisis, to coin a phrase. Pandora's box, when it was opened, and everything escaped from it, left one thing within it, and that was hope. And so I think there is hope for our cities, but we need to seize the day. We need to actually take action. So we need to start thinking more actively about dissociating place from production. And this is going to go more easily for the information workers than it will for Amazon. I'm not quite sure how that works yet. But we need to actually stop, as planners, for example, arguing that where you work, where you live, where you go for a coffee are different places in the way that we have in the past with our zoning systems. We need to design for public health. This is an image projecting a healthy new town in the UK. Basically, we're going to need a lot more space, because people are going to take a while to get back to the idea that they can closely associate, I think, after COVID. But actually, that's great, because that means we can have really beautiful cities which have gorgeous public realm in them. We just need to make sure that we invest in that. We need to be adaptable, as Tim has pointed out. And we need to put the public realm back into the public realm. So again, the previous two speakers have both, I think, made this point. And this is actually, when I say the public realm, I mean the realm of politics and engagement. So in ancient Athens, people engaged in the agora. And I think, as Tim was saying, we'll see more interaction between people working and people in public spaces, but we should actually design for that, I think, and build this kind of space. We need to nurture creativity and learning, because if you actually don't nurture that, you will end up in an Amazon warehouse servicing people who have done that. So we need to actually make sure we distribute those things better. I've gone for the 15-minute neighborhood, Tim, but I'll stick with 20 minutes if you like. We certainly need to plan for that. And I think we need to think about public transport as premium transport, or all transport as premium transport, as a social investment. At the moment, we tend to think it's a private choice. We need to actually engage much more in what happened many, many years ago. I've just been reading a paper that says that the last time that we had a public transport system that was really engaged in the public interest was 1914 in the UK. We need to think much more about how we move people around in a green and sustainable way. And all this is about economic and environmental justice. And the reason for that is because we must multitask. We must actually take COVID-19 as an accelerant that also helps us to deal with issues like global warming, our obesity crisis, and so on. Because if we don't, as it says at the bottom of this slide, we will be stupid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I, like you were saying, a lot of my points have been made in different ways and in probably better ways before in this conversation. And I hope I can sort of double down on some of these ideas that are coming through here, and in particular, the call you're making for really sort of grasping this opportunity and taking this opportunity to double down on and accelerate some of these tendencies. So I'll try and tailor my remarks a little bit to what's been said, but again, my apologies for any repetition. So I've got here just a few sort of key questions we might look at connected to this. again, without easy or ready answers, and in many ways very provisional kind of thoughts. But I was sort of trying to think through a little bit about some of the implications of this from a geographical and urban geographical perspective, and see what comes up. So the first one here is it's been mentioned briefly before, but I certainly agree that this crisis seems to have brought smaller cities onto the radar as potentially not only places where people find it more preferable to live for various ways, but potentially to work as well. This is questioning our need to congregate in large cities with this more flexible work patterns, ability to travel more infrequently. Does this open up some opportunities here for smaller cities? There are a couple of angles here that I think we should consider, which is again, building on what Richard's saying, how can we really grapple with this, really grasp this opportunity to target and double down on this potential drift towards secondary or tertiary cities, these sort of smaller cities, types of places where I live. How can we really kind of focus the energy and resources in there, help investment, and think about targeting various policies to really capture this potential drift, because I think it's a great opportunity for smaller cities just in and of themselves to support their economies and environments, but also offers a greater potential for affordability outside the broader metropolitan areas as well. So some broader opportunities here, but also specific opportunities for those cities. It obviously it demands some questions about what does, for example, YIMBY, yes in my backyard, or the NIMBY sort of movement look like in smaller city environments. How do smaller cities offer different opportunities for biophilic urbanism, connecting nature and cities? Can it be done, and should it be done in a different way there, considering these cities might be more directly connected to nature? And I think that we want to sort of think about how smaller cities might offer the best of both worlds in various different ways, and what that might mean in the 21st century here, without sort of a drift into the potential traps of being the worst of both worlds. So just trying to sort of think through about sort of maximizing the opportunities of cities, of small cities. I think related to this is perhaps rethinking about the suburbs a little. How might they become newly reimagined, designed around people spending more of the working day there and spending more time there? And obviously, I think that's really important work being done by people like Ellen Dunham-Jones about retrofitting suburbia and bringing more sort of destinations and compactness and different forms of mobility into the suburbs. And I think that strikes me as an important, at least in the US context, a really important line of thought. The next one here is about resilience and responsiveness. It's been spoken about a little bit already, but I completely agree, and I'm seeing it here about what how important flexibility is within planning. Planning tends to be this pretty rigid sort of framework. How can we develop more flexibility, more opportunity for adaptability into our planning systems? Are we going to see some more dusting off of, for example, here in the US context, form-based coding? How might we rethink things like LEAD and BREEAM to include more about adaptability and flexibility? How might those kinds of instruments be rewritten on perhaps a neighborhood level or a building by building level? And again, flexibility in transportation systems as well. We're seeing, there was a initial sort of outburst here in the US of some micro mobility and those kinds of things. What do they look like now? How does mobility look in this new era? And what does it mean for those who need to commute every day? If we're seeing this kind of shift away from mass forms of public transportation, in that deprioritization, who is getting lost, who is suffering from that? Moving on to questions of hybridity, Chiara mentioned this really nicely about sort of notion of hybridity in urban spaces, and in particular ways to think about combating isolation. One of the great saving graces perhaps of where I'm living right now in terms of getting through this pandemic with my family, my children here, has been the existence of porches, for example, as this wonderful in-between space, right, between the public realm and the private realm, and the existence really on this kind of granular level of elements of architecture being particularly liberating as creating these sort of opportunities for more social neighborhoods. So, you know, extrapolating from the porch, what might permeability, this sort of social design really look like, and how can we sort of translate that using instruments of design and planning more broadly. I think, you know, we want to think about connections between things. Obviously, I mean, we're talking about hybridity, but I think that we also need to think about connections between entities. You know, this isolation, I think, is in many ways revealed the need for better connections. So how do we connect? For example, I'm working in a university context, you know, the university campus and the city. How do we better connect those things in interesting ways? And people have talked about the, you know, work-life hybridity, and I think that, you know, our zoning instruments, again, in the US planning context, have a lot to answer for here in terms of sort of moving away from single-use zoning. My anxiety is a little bit if we're talking about the rise of smaller cities and secondary cities in terms of being places of potential growth in this new era. There's a question about how much these places, on the one hand, can be really interesting laboratories of rethinking zoning, rethinking planning and development. You know, there's less inertia and bureaucratic stickiness in various different ways potentially. So these places can be kind of, you know, fairly nimble laboratories on the one hand for things. Smaller cities often will also have a little bit perhaps more conservatism than larger cities. And how does that channel, shape, affect sort of responses to this pandemic, and especially in terms of sort of planning? And I've worked for a number of years here in city planning, and you know, it's potentially a different model of sort of planning that needs to be employed in these smaller urban environments with this sort of potentially greater conservatism you might see there. So how is this both opening up new opportunities, but also potentially missing some opportunities in the smaller city? And then, you know, as everybody sort of mentioned here, how do we sort of facilitate all this kind of opportunity for the, you know, the social existence of life and work? How do we create a more humanistic planning and humanistic architecture? And there's a whole bunch of literature in geography that I won't bore you with on this topic, but there's a whole lot there. And it was really intriguing to see earlier those mental maps, you know, that sort of maybe sort of reflect or think about those kinds of questions. I've also flagged here what this might reveal about our learning spaces. You know, I can talk specifically about sort of working in university planning here, university and college spaces, but also to an extent, you know, the primary and secondary schooling, K-12 schools as well. I have two children in elementary school here. There's obviously a lot going on. I think, you know, education has been challenged and potentially augmented in different ways by this. Are we seeing the redundancy of the campus model? And again, perhaps I'm thinking more of a US context here. Does it sort of present itself now almost kind of Ozymandias-like kind of hulks, which they were the greatest things, and now they're just these sort of dusty ghost edifices? I think not. I think that there are opportunities here to connect them in different ways and to rethink them. I think that we've seen technology can enhance and augment learning, but clearly there are some things that are missing, and we're seeing, you know, the problems of student peer support and the kind of the networks around learning and the communities of learning, which are really important to students of all ages, that need to be kind of facilitated and that can really only happen in space. You know, we've talked about the sort of importance of sidebar conversations and informal education, of sort of talking with, you know, your teachers or educators or fellow students in, you know, before or after classes. Those kinds of things, those kinds of encounters are really important for education. It's been revealed, and I think people already knew to some extent. But so how can we design buildings and design learning spaces around those kinds of distilled, essential kind of things, which we can't seem to recreate effectively on Zoom or your platform of choice? And so finally, I've got here just a sort of perhaps a more intellectual question, but just thinking about, you know, going beyond, you know, our immediate environments here in terms of, you know, epistemology, almost ontology. What do we actually know, and how do we learn what's going on elsewhere in the world? You know, we've been trapped, as everyone was saying, in our four walls for a long time here, not, you know, in this lockdown environment. You know, we're spending so much time looking inwardly and in a constrained way. But this has also, ironically, coincidentally, whatever, opened up capacity to connect much more broadly. For example, me, engaging in this experience, which I wouldn't be able to do if it was just held in situ in London. It's opened up new encounters, potential for new experiences. And I think that we got to sort of really think about this in terms of the opportunity to learn about best practices and ideas from elsewhere. I hope that through this we can kind of keep the momentum going through making these kind of connections that don't necessarily need to happen in person, and we can learn about best practices in planning or development or architecture or engineering being done elsewhere in the world. I, for one, have been furiously taking down notes in this discussion so far. For example, to take back to directly to some zoning ordinance amendment work we're doing here, and these kinds of opportunities. I hope we can kind of persist with, and we can learn from elsewhere in new ways, and also go beyond the sort of the big Western city standard, to places in the global South, to smaller cities as well, and to learn more from those places about what works and what makes sense, and in the other ways of an opportunity and obligation perhaps to share. So I think there are certainly some opportunities here for thinking about those things. And I'll take a break there, but there's been just an interesting conversation so far, and I will pass on to Greg here.
Thanks, Henry. Like you, I've been taking quite a lot of notes on the way. Really enjoyed everyone's contributions so far. So no slides from me. I've just got a few observations to make. So I've been researching how people respond to travel disruptions for about a decade now, and our findings are fairly clear and consistent over time. There's three sort of broad categories I think that are relevant here. So people's coping strategies are generally to do more of what they sometimes do anyway. So if you work from home, you'll work from home more. If you sometimes cycled, and that's an option, you'll do that more. If you shared your caring responsibilities with someone else, then you're more likely to be in negotiations with how to reconfigure all of that stuff. The second one is that there's more potential to adapt than is ever considered in public policy. And I think one of the reasons for this is not all of the adaptations in a disruption or a crisis like this are necessarily great for people. So there's a lot of people who've been staying in a lot in circumstances or accommodation that just isn't good. So we can risk confusing the adaptations that people could stick with and would be positive with the general noise of disruptions being bad events and a need to kind of get back to normal, as I think Chiara said, rather than moving on to the a better set of circumstances. And the third point, which I think is really important, is when institutions adapt their behaviours and their expectations of people, then this unlocks a lot more potential for change. So the difference between your business supporting you to work from home or expecting you to be in is huge as to what you then consider your individual choice set to look like. What is it that's seen to be normal in your way of work? And that cuts across all sorts of different activities. So what have we learned from coronavirus? Well, obviously that many more roles can be done remotely than had ever been considered possible. And that's an adaptation of institutional norms. So jobs that you must be in the office for suddenly became jobs that you must be at home for. So that's a radical flip. So we've had many more millions of people who can work from home who never did it, as well as those who've done it a bit more. Now, whether that's all a good thing or not, I think we can discuss. Will it matter in the long term? So will people stick with it? Well, we're in the midst of a longitudinal panel survey. We're doing some interviews with the public and decision makers as well. So I'll make my comments on the basis of what we've learned so far, and I've put a link to the website on the chat. One thing to say, I'm focusing on the way we work. Commute is only 20% of all the trips that we make. Even at 8 till 9 in the morning, it's only 20% of the trips that you see on a network. So sometimes people are surprised by how little difference the kind of change in working practices makes to overall traffic levels, or just hold that context in mind. So I think what will happen in the future is going to depend a lot on how long this goes on for. I think the longer it goes on for, the more embedded the changes in business practices and working practices will become, the more adaptations we'll make to make that better. So it will be an accelerant to change that's going on anyway. Let's presume that those people who can work from home and for whom that is actually a good circumstance for them, start doing so perhaps regularly 2 days a week. Now, how that will impact will depend on whether it's Mondays and Fridays that we all decide to take at home and restructure the week that way, or whether it spreads out across the whole week. But either way, it's going to take a huge chunk of economic activity out of our city centres, and it's going to put that activity where people choose to live. So this means that we won't need to cram quite so many rail services into our morning timetable. We'll probably have a more reliable and pleasant service. We ought to be spending far less money on it than we do at the moment, because it's hugely expensive to get an extra set of trains into an already overcrowded system, for example, in our major cities. But it's also going to mean lower demand for office space, commercial rents, and all of the servicing that goes around central offices, including hospitality industry. And I think that's all magnified by the acceleration to online shopping. So physical shopping is never going to disappear, but online had already made it to 17% of all sales by value in the UK by 2019, and it's going to be breaking all those records this year. So what to do then? Well, I think that depends a bit. What's happened is part of what needs to happen in order for us to be on a climate compliant pathway. So we need to be traveling a bit less for those things that we don't need to travel for. However, in the past, as was pointed out earlier, people have traded off traveling fewer days a week for work with moving further from work. I'm a little bit concerned that we're seeing this transition happen alongside the electrification of the private car, which lowers the per mile motoring costs. So this could actually stimulate a new wave of deurbanization at a point where we haven't actually got clean energy to fuel all of those vehicles. The potential gains of people living more localized lives in their neighborhoods could be ephemeral. I think they need to be made, and I think that's a point made quite powerfully by the previous speakers. You can't just assume that this is going to happen. You have to create new ways of living and try and make that happen. But I think either way, there's going to be more space in city centres, fewer offices or square footage, fewer shops. And I think now's the time to creatively reimagine some of those spaces as for low carbon living. They're all super well connected by public transport, and having people living in city centres and moving from the city centre to outside of the city centre will really help in terms of balancing transport systems. So I'd really love to see a new approach to creatively reimagining our city centres. But as I say, it's not just the city centre that matters. So I think for us to make the most of it, we need to see this as a policy opportunity. And I think there's still a risk that we will treat this as something to go away from as a bad experience in public policy terms. And I think it's going to require local and national government, businesses, neighbourhoods and community groups to try and work together to embed the more sustainable practices that we want to keep. And if we don't, and we just allow things to drift back, then there are some other headwinds that could take us in the wrong direction. So that's what I want to say as my introductory remarks, and I'll hand over to Helen Page.
So I'm Helen Page. By day, I'm a structural engineer, but today I've taken my structural engineering hat off, and actually what I'm going to talk about is a very personal take on the subject. So here in England, we are in the first few days of our second national lockdown, and I'd like to take you back just for a few moments to the first national lockdown back in the spring when it was pretty sunny. And we were only allowed outside for about an hour a day for exercise. But during that time, the cars were just not moving on the streets at all. So people started walking down the middle of the streets, really enjoying using their whole streets. And you started seeing kids on bikes, actually cycling in the roads rather than on the pavements. And for a brief while, the cars were no longer king of our cities. We also kind of could hear the birds and notice the birds and the bees and kind of got a bit more reconnected with nature. We stood on our doorsteps and we clapped for the NHS every Thursday and saw our neighbours and appreciated our communities a bit more. And those were all positive upsides that I'd kind of like you to keep in your mind. During that time I was on furlough, I signed up for an engineering mini master's course, and we were set the topic of engineering a better future. Brilliant project title, could have taken you anywhere in the world, thinking about anything at all. So where it took me was just outside my front door to my own street. So I was thinking about the way we'd been enjoying using our street, and I was thinking a lot about climate change at the time. And so I'm just going to briefly share with you the project work that I came up with through that. I ended up redesigning our street for a greener future. So as I said, this is not my professional bread and butter. So there was a couple of statistics I discovered that really surprised me. The first being that on average, cars spend only 4% of their time in use. The rest of the time they are parked somewhere. And then even when they are moving, the average occupancy rate is only 1.6 people, when most cars are designed to carry 5. And that struck me as hugely inefficient, and there must be a better way to organise our transport needs than this, really. I was, but I saw some hope. We are moving towards electric cars. There's autonomous driving technologies coming along. People are using apps like Uber for transport. And I wondered if there might be a future where all of that comes together. And maybe if we had a fleet of shared vehicles stored in car parks, you call one up, it comes and gets you. It's exactly the right size you need for that trip, and you only have it for the time you need it. In that kind of situation, we could have many fewer cars on the roads, and the ones that were there, lots of them could be a lot smaller. And I imagine in that kind of situation, we could get rid of the need for on-street parking for private cars. So I set myself the brief of imagining what my street could look like in this new world. How could we better use all that space the cars are sitting on? I set myself some design criteria, the main one being to try and reclaim at least 50% of the road space for better public use. So I live in Hart Road in St Albans. St Albans is a little town just north of London, busy market town. This is the aerial view of the town. So if you can see down the middle here, there's a sort of crossroads. That's the very centre of town. Hart Road is just here, a little bit south of that. And the other reference point I'll give you is the station is here. That's about a 7-minute walk, to give you an idea of scale of the town. And this is aerial view of my street. And as you can see, lots of cars parked either side. That is the fairly typical what happens during a day on a weekday. Most of the cars are there all the time. So Hart Road joins up with another road called Pageant Road and a road called Keyfield Terrace. Both of those roads are dead ends. So you only drive up here and into these roads if you're coming to visit people who live there. Here's some pictures of my road. So as you can see, cars on both sides, just space for one car to drive down the middle. These two at the bottom are the slightly wider dead end spaces that I was talking about. You see all our houses are very close to the road. No one really has space for front gardens as such. So I'm thinking cars come out, what could we put back instead? What would be better? First of all, what would be better for nature? Trees obviously spring to mind. I think everyone is aware that we need to try and get as many trees squeezed into as many places as possible on the planet to help combat climate change. I think that's particularly important that we get more trees back into cities, because not only are they going to absorb carbon, but they provide shading and they can knock several degrees off temperatures and hot days, which is going to be pretty important in a warming world to make cities still bearable to live in. I was thinking about planters and community gardening and lots of other things for nature. I was thinking about how to make it better for people. So could we get seating out there so people could enjoy spending time in this potentially new green space? Could we add in some bike storage? We all have to hoik our bikes from our back gardens through our houses onto the street. I know for one that if I didn't have to move my kitchen table every time I wanted to get on my bike, I would use it about twice as much. So I would love some on-street bike parking in our road. Maybe some public art, wouldn't that be cool? Better for sport, better for play, some children's play equipment. Could we start seeing that on our streets? Might there be corners where you could actually fit courts for basketball or tennis or other kind of games? So those are thoughts in my mind as I started drawing up what might actually fit in my street. So the drawing on the left here is just the existing layout. for sizing. And then I just did a basic one where I sketched up how much space they might need for car drop-off zones to come and collect you, drop you off with your shopping, and worked out how much space I'd need if I was trying to provide 2 bike spaces per house along our street. So then I was left with all this green space here, which could be used for small trees, bushes, wildflowers, lawns, that kind of stuff. And I was pretty pleased that I regained 51% of that, what was previously tarmacked parking for new uses. I looked at several other options, but I'm just going to talk about option D down here. So although this has got the same amount of space reclaimed, what I've done here is, rather than run the road down the middle, I've pulled it over next to this pavement, which joins all the green space together, which I think helps with choices of how you might use that. Also puts the trees right in the middle, so you can then have bigger species because it's not so far from the houses. So then this is what it then ended up looking like for the street as a whole. So I ended up with a one-way system with a car drop-off spaces labelled C, and the bike storage labelled B, and then everything else was trees or planting. I got in a space for some art, I got in space for seating. These dead end spaces down the end, which were currently sort of nothingness really, become places of joy, frankly, with community veg planters, playground stuff, tables where people can either watch your children on the playground or enjoy your drink from the pub, maybe have a game of pétanque. And I was delighted to find I could even fit a tennis court in up here. So I would love a future road like this, and I'm sure my neighbours would too. So sort of to finish on this 3D sketch really, but I can, COVID pandemic will undoubtedly have long-lasting effects, I think, for many on where and how we choose to work, and that will have knock-on effects on our city centres and our suburbs. But the pandemic's also shown us that we can make quite drastic changes that we never thought would be going to be possible in quite short amounts of time. And I think that's very encouraging, especially when thinking about things like how we're going to tackle climate emergency in the future. So I would argue that I think as many people will choose to spend more time working from home, the environments just outside our front doors and our local communities, we will value them more. So I would hope we could strive to remember the upsides of life during lockdown and to work towards making some of those positive things possible again in our way we design our future cities. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Helen. Nice to end on something visionary. So now it would be good to open it out to the floor and pick up on some of the questions that you guys have been asking in the chat box. So Alina, I wondered if you might want to pose your questions around things like the conversion of office spaces, or the sort of revisiting modernist new town planning, and I wondered if you had anyone in particular you wanted to direct those towards.
Thanks very much. I'm a trustee of the Art Trust in Harlow, and we're really interested there in drawing out some of the good principles from new town planning. And it's been really striking in Basildon how that's one of the towns that's bounced back very quickly. I guess I'm just interested in what lessons we can take from new towns in terms of green space or cycling, or sort of wide pavements, and if there are things there in that perhaps somewhat unfashionable period of our planning that we can take forward to help us now.
I don't know if perhaps Tim, do you want to respond to that? Do you have any perspectives on that?
Nothing springs to mind, sorry.
No, that's right. What about Richard, do you have any?
Yes, I think the first thing to say is that although the new towns were in some cases unfashionable and in some cases horrible, I think of Cumbernauld, actually they tended to be built with quite a strong emphasis on the public realm and public space and greenery. The ultimate example being Harlow, where Gibbard, who designed it, said that he'd actually taken the landscape as the bones of the city. or the town, as it was to begin with. So I think the first thing we can learn actually is that the idea of planning a place holistically and thinking about both the outside and the inside is really critical. And the second thing is that we need to understand, I think, and I should declare at this point that I'm a trustee of CPRE, the countryside charity. So I probably would say this, wouldn't I? But I actually believe it, is that our cities need quite a lot of greenery to deal with climate change as well. So it's a double win. You can win in both senses. The challenge has been how to look after those spaces. And the other interest I'll declare is that I was chief executive of CABE, Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. And we had a unit called CABE Space, which works on trying to promote the idea that we should value our parks and public spaces. And local authorities have been really pressured of late in the UK in terms of resources. It'd be kind of interesting to hear about international experience on this. Well, we've had a very municipal model. So I actually really liked the very last presentation, because it's a way of thinking about how communities can start to retake ownership. So if you're in your area more and spending less time commuting, can we actually engage communities to get much more involved in creating and looking after their public realm? And can, as I was saying in my talk, can that public realm become the public realm as well? Can this be where you meet your local councillor and start to engage them? I mean, when I bump into my local councillor, it's usually when I'm doing my front garden, which I'm lucky enough to have, and they're walking past and I grab them by the throat. So I think actually we could engage much more at a community level and take much more responsibility ourselves for these public spaces. Now, that's quite challenging for some local authorities, which still, and I worked for a local authority for a time, and I know that councillors feel very often it's their personal responsibility to look after all this stuff. But perhaps it could become their personal responsibility to become the facilitators for the community, to actually start to engage in healthy pastimes, like guerrilla gardening, for example, which has been quite successful in some parts of the country. So I think we need to kind of recast the role of the local authority, perhaps from being the provider of all to being the facilitator of all.
Interesting point. Andrew, did you have something you wanted to add in there?
Well, I was only going to say, as I spent the first 20 years of my life growing up next to Harlow New Town and watched it grow, when I go back there now and look at the town, the huge difference is that there is no places of work. It used to have educational toy manufacturers, Longman Publishing, a big electronics company. None of them are there, and the whole industrial zone is turned into a whole series of shopping spaces. And I think that is, because we're talking about the way we work, I think that's a big thing you have to consider, that there's more than just blue collar working and sitting at our computer screens. There's a sort of bigger world of work that places like Harlow had the right dream, but our modern working practices don't quite fit the town anymore.
Interesting. And I guess also I just wanted to pick up on what you were saying towards the end there, Richard, is perhaps an answer to someone, oh, let me find it, from Brian's question around, how we kind of support our local councils and local planning teams in some of this, and the idea of local facilities as local authorities as facilitators and not providers, I think is quite an interesting response to that, and how we enable them or can support them in picking up some of those things. Ruby, did you want to bring some of your questions to the panel?
Hi, yeah, I think those were really amazing presentations. I really enjoyed all of them, especially Helen's one at the end there. I think I'm a transport planner, and I think there's a really well documented issue in kind of architecture and urban planning, but particularly in transport planning, of the people doing the planning planning for themselves and not necessarily taking into account the perspectives of anybody else. And I suppose what strikes me through a lot of these presentations with a kind of, and I think it's great that we kind of are able to take so many positives from it, but we're all coming from a very specific perspective where we're able to do our jobs from home. And there are an awful lot of people who aren't able to do that. And there are an awful lot of people who aren't represented by the people doing the planning. And so I just was wondering if there's any specific ideas that people have on how we kind of make sure that they don't get drowned out by those kind of, isn't it wonderful that we don't have to commute anymore type thoughts, and particularly in terms of everything going online and kind of how that specifically excludes, for example, older people or people with disabilities, where engagement online is just really difficult and presents a really big barrier in itself.
Do any of the panelists want to respond to that?
I suppose shall I chip in first again as I raise the issue? I'd just like to say, as an older person, as I am, and someone who spent quite a lot of their career involved with with computing and so on, I don't think we should stereotype everybody either as silver surfers or as people who are too old to use the internet. My mum, who's 92 at the moment, was just talking to me on Alexa, for example. So I think actually this stuff is kind of penetrating further than you think. But I actually do agree, Helen, that sorry, Ruby. I do agree, Ruby, that there is a challenge here. If you're in an Amazon warehouse, then you don't have the opportunity to work from home, and I suppose that you'll be replaced by a robot very soon. So for me, I think one key issue is how we make sure that everybody has equality of access to things like learning. And we just heard today in the UK that from the schools inspectorate that children who are not living with parents who homeschool them have slipped back by 1 or 2 years in their learning and education. So there's already a kind of divide starting to appear. I mean, the sorts of things that I've done on transport in the past have been citizens' juries, where we went out and deliberately selected, using Ipsos Mori, other firms are available. We went out and selected people from a wide range of different backgrounds in the community and brought them together. So I think that kind of citizen engagement is important. And at the moment, our planning system is quite rubbish in most of the way it engages people, actually. I mean, you get great one-off examples, and I see Nick Folks here, and Nick's been involved in Cheltenham with the Academy of Urbanism in some really amazing stuff where you gather communities together in charrettes, but actually most of the time that doesn't happen. So I think we need, and with the government's planning reforms, we really need to invest a lot in engaging communities in planning and making them the skilled local experts that they really are. So I'm hogging the floor, but that's the personal view.
I was just going to chip in to say exactly the same thing. The phrase that sprung to mind for me was people's parliaments, which I guess is the same thing as your citizens' juries. So yeah, a bit more of that would be good, wouldn't it?
I come in, Celia, on that. I think it's a really important issue which Ruby's raised. I mean, I think one thing to say is lower traffic levels are generally a good thing for those communities who don't own cars, because they tend to be the communities through which high levels of traffic flow. I mean, that's one of the benefits we saw in terms of air quality improvements during the lockdown period. I guess my big concern is a lot of the narrative, and you've seen it with the RAC report, and there was something else in the Guardian today as well, a lot of narrative about what's going to happen to car use in the future, people going back to that. I think it's a real worry for the 25% of the population that don't own cars and are completely reliant on public transport, about what the future of that is going to be. And I think we do have to accept that there are some people who will either not go back to public transport or not go back to the same degree that they did before. And if those trips can't be done by active modes, and then there's a real risk of a loss of mobility for them. spent a lot of money keeping the services going right now, but how long's the magic money tree going to continue to print money to fund the service levels? If people don't go back to the bus, you know, there'll be risks of real cuts to those services. So I think the equity outcomes of this are really, really critical, and we need to start turning our heads to thinking about them. But in our work with decision makers, they're still just trying to survive the decisions they need to make this month and next month, and you know, they don't really know when things will begin to pick up again. So really important questions to keep our eyes on. I don't think I've got any clear answers.
And while we've got you, Greg, I wondered if you wanted to respond to Chris Twin's query about kind of just the funding model, I guess, behind public transport, and if you had any thoughts around that.
Well, I suppose crises reveal various things about public policy, and on this occasion, it's revealed that the government is prepared to fund to an enormous degree. I mean, you're talking about an extra, it's something like an extra £8 billion a year, the rail network, which is only carrying a 30% of the traffic it was before, you know, and it's hundreds of millions of pounds a month for bus services. So in a sense, it shows that governments recognise these are critically important social services. The question is, how long does that, you know, that recognition continue? And you know, before COVID-19, we were talking about having to have double-digit increases in public transport use just to meet climate change goals. You know, that hasn't gone away when we start becoming a bit more post-COVID in terms of how we think about the world. Those challenges will still be there, and if we're not prepared to put the money in to support the network, then, you know, where else are we going to make those savings? It's a real long-term challenge. So I think it's going to require more. It's going to require more money from public finance. It can't be user fees. There's no way that will work or be equitable. And so where's that going to come from? I think a reform of the way we pay for driving is the only. It's the only, or general taxation. There'll be a lot of calls on general taxation.
Oh, thank you for that. Nick Falk, I think you had some comments you wanted to make or queries to the panel.
Yes, I view this with fascination, because it seems to me we're talking about a future which is the very opposite of the one that's needed to deal with climate change and the many other huge challenges facing the world. We're quite possibly witnessing the disintegration of the cities that were the foundations of our civilization. And just spending lots of money subsidizing existing services doesn't get the change of direction that's needed, in my view, to rebalance our towns and cities. So I raised the question about property values. I hate to be depressing. I know people love to think that if you just discuss things on one media or another and you plan and draw up a great visual picture of the future, we will move towards it. But we also are affected by values of property and by the way investment goes. And public investment is a fraction of the total value of investment that's required or happens all the time. So I wanted to get people thinking about how you would change things. I've suggested the city is probably turning inside out, but also upside down, and that we would need to change the way we tax property. We would need to make it much cheaper to use property in the center of our cities and our towns, starting with rates. And we need to make car parking on the periphery much more expensive. So I'd be very interested in reactions to that. It may be that Greg is the person to focus on, because if you've raised the issue of money, and I'd like to see whether you think there is an appetite for rethinking the property tax system that we have in this country, which is particularly bad, by the way, because we tax the occupier, not the owner, unlike other countries.
Yeah, can I reply to this comment just briefly? Thank you for raising this point, and I'm sorry for like interrupting the answer, but I just had this in my mind. I think that there are some models that are now under elaboration that basically entail dynamic pricing for different types of services, for instance, facility management services. And I think that this might be one of the solutions or possible futures, in the sense that this would I think the challenge should be to price higher what gets used in the worst way. So for instance, I don't know, if I have a house that I never use and it's always empty, then I have to pay because it's like something that stays on the ground and occupies space, but is not effectively used. So in this sense, I think that the technology can help us a lot to understand how we are currently using the spaces and how this can be, optimized. So that would be my...
Absolutely. It's thinking as an economist, you would start thinking about the opportunity cost and the waste that occurs. It's all very well to have trains trundling up and down across the country, carrying nobody, but it's not a very good use of society's resources. So obviously you want to fill them with people, so you want to make train travel very cheap, and you want to make car travel very expensive. You want to make empty houses expensive and full houses cheap, and so on. It's just getting back to some common sense about using resources better. I think that the crisis, which is perhaps like going through a war, may cause us, as we did in the Second World War, to rethink the way we do things. After the Second World War, we invented in the UK and possibly most of Europe the welfare state. Well, if you treat COVID as a kind of war, or if you like, it's anticipating the sort of war that climate change will bring in many countries, then you would change the way you behave. And you would create financial incentives to do that. You wouldn't just rely on faith, which I think planning is a form of religion. You know, it assumes that if you like sing the various hymns properly, that somehow somebody will listen. Well, I don't think it's like that in a state of decline. It's in a state of growth, but it's not when things are going bad. I'm afraid it doesn't rebuild confidence.
Thank you, Nick. Do any of the other panelists have any other comments they wanted to add to that? We're all square. All right, Kara, I think you had a question for Henry about creativity in spaces.
Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, because I read some literature referring to how these big cities are supporting creativity, innovation, entrepreneurship, etc. And so my question would be, if the future is going to see these big cities become more empty and instead people distributing better in smaller cities, are we going to lose some of these creativity opportunities or not? We will maybe resiliently evolve new ways to become creative.
Thanks, Cheryl. That's a great comment, a great point, and certainly one has to think about kind of sort of balancing up here. Is it, you know, I know you're not asking, is it a zero-sum thing between big cities and small cities and that kind of stuff? It's more that big cities themselves bring these opportunities for creativity and entrepreneurship and collaboration. It's the kind of the knowledge spillover kind of effects, right? And those kinds of benefits of urbanization for clustering and agglomeration. Do you get the same things in small cities where there's just numerically, you know, fewer people and there's fewer encounters and exchanges? And I think that is an excellent consideration and something to think about. I suppose I would firstly, I would say, in kind of rebutting my own point, I hope there's enough room for both those things, that you can not only get you know, the innovation that you're talking about happening at small cities as well as larger cities, but perhaps through that actually opening up to more people who maybe can't afford to live in the bigger cities or perhaps haven't got the access to those spaces, that there's a potential for a slightly more decentered innovation sort of opportunity there existing. Maybe that's Panglossian, you know, a bit too optimistic, but I think there's some potential there if we were to think it through. the second point is, and this builds on what a lot of other people are saying, is, you know, I think that we've got to sort of grasp this opportunity to actually invest in this and do something about it. And it's going to work differently in terms of how this support works in different countries and in different states here in the US and across different cities here in the US. But, you know, trying to facilitate and nurture creativity and innovation in small cities is definitely something that has been looked at, that should be done more, and potentially something to double down on. There are lots of different strategies that smaller cities can take in terms of creating innovation districts, looking for tax breaks, looking to support infrastructure in smaller cities, right? You know, extending out communications technology in different ways to these places. That's the second point. Third, sorry, I'm just brainstorming here, and I apologize if I go on too much, but I mean, third would be thinking about specialization within smaller cities. So the great benefit of big cities is they're very diverse, lots of things going on there economically and diverse demographically as well. Well, small cities can also be quite diverse demographically. There's lots of, you know, different small city conditions out there in terms of demographics, but can they also be, you know, spaces which sort of double down on particular kind of phenomena, maybe economic innovation, maybe in terms of, you know, food production and food technology for some places that are more rural. You know, here in the US, the college town phenomenon, right? Those are the places that are going to be really benefiting from this, with those kind of spillovers from universities to their immediate sort of communities. But what I do worry about with that is that emerges sort of a hierarchy of smaller cities there. So not only do we get, you know, big cities versus smaller or mid-sized cities, but also within the small city kind of constellation, there's going to be some that are really sort of advantaged, you know, perhaps those ones that already have a deep kind of knowledge economy around universities, and those which perhaps don't and are maybe more geographically separate and geographically further away from the big cities where people move to. So I think, you know, there's a number of strategies that one can take, but a number of challenges in that. And I think also, just again, speaking from my position here in a small city that isn't, you know, an especially wealthy small city, there's a strong kind of risk aversion that comes with not only the conservatism of small cities, but also just the constraint on resources here, right? I mean, there's not the money to throw at things. That, you know, it's risky to rip up your zoning ordinances. It's risky to really sort of think beyond the pale in some of these places. And so I think one of the reasons you get, you know, there's not the potential innovation and opportunities for really rethinking planning and urbanism and design and architecture in places is a bit of a risk aversion and a worry about losing those scarce economic resources that are already here. So perhaps it comes back to what a lot of people have been saying, that kind of to break that knot, you need to kind of, you know, really target and really focus investment and bring attention to these in other ways. So that's what I would say at this point.
So yeah, maybe we could just go around our panelists in the order in which you spoke, and if you have any closing remarks or comments you'd like to make before we wrap up, it would be great to hear them.
So thank you again for having me here. It was a great conversation we had. I haven't elaborated on a closing remark, but I had one thought that I would like to share. I saw an app basically trying to propose different paths. So building on the model of Google Maps, for instance, you would just be able to try to select different paths according to what you want to do. Like if you want to be efficient, or if you want to, I don't know, have a sightseeing, or if you want to go shopping and this kind of stuff. So while going from A to B, you can still take different streets and have different experiences. So I hope this will, I don't know, like expand in the future and affect all our lives. And I think that this COVID is inspiring us in this direction to take the most out of what we have and discover new little things around us. Thank you.
What I was going to say was, thank you. It's been an interesting conversation. I think what I was going to take away was Richard's reference back to Agoras as being the place for public debate and collaboration, and everything from our street level, as Helen mentions, sort of seeing our neighbours through to our towns and our cities. How I think there's an interesting idea of getting our town councillors in the public square to have a proper discussion with them on a regular basis without rotten fruit. But yeah, that's what I'm taking with me.
Thanks. I wanted to take away Helen's project for designing the street, but I wanted to move Helen to India. And not at the moment, obviously, once COVID's died down. And I wanted to think about what would it have been like if Helen had been designing for a slightly more main road in India. And what she would have been doing is creating space for entrepreneurship in the street, because actually the streets in India, not the very, very local ones, but above that, are where people go to trade when they are not yet a business or developing a business. And we're very tight in the way that in the West, or most places I've been in the West, in the way we actually control our streets. And there are historical reasons for that. But it seems to me we now have 14% youth unemployment in the UK as of today. So it seems to me that actually if we wanted to see a bit of vibrancy and entrepreneurship in the streets, perhaps we kind of take Helen's project, but turn it into looking for ways to create spaces for entrepreneurship where you don't pay a fortune for access to the street, and see if we can get a bit of vibrancy back into our streets that way.
I think there's so many really interesting both points and conundrums here, which have been fascinating. I just throw out a couple of sort of more explicitly geographical points here, a couple of pieces of geography. Perhaps one of the opportunities to rethink planning and public engagement in planning and the accessibility of planning is to think about how small cities again give that opportunity for greater public engagement, because there's less of a remote bureaucracy kind of idea. It's a little bit more accessible. It's a little bit more smaller scale. And I've seen that here. People can literally kind of encounter and engage with planning a little bit more closely. So in size potentially comes opportunity as well as some problems as well. So just connecting a couple of dots there. And then the second point is just about there's a lot of talk obviously about how technology has impacted space, right? The idea of time-space compression, how transportation technology facilitate that that compression. Sort of time has annihilated space and all that kind of stuff. Think about how technology has impacted place as that corollary kind of idea of the distinctive, unique points on our Earth's surface in our cities. How has technology impacted place? How has technology, instead of annihilated place, revitalized place in different ways? And I think there's some interesting questions there to explore.
Thanks. I think my takeaway concept would be think about more deliberate workplaces. I really like that as an idea of what the future of work's going to look like. I think the concept that I'm kind of thinking about, I think it might have been you, Henry, that said is resilience flexibility. Don't know whether I agree with that, but I certainly want to think about it. But I think resilience is accessibility. So we're really vulnerable to distance. When things go wrong, it's when you're spatially separated from the things you need to take part in that becomes problematic. And the corollary of that is that where things are more accessible, they're also more inclusive because they're accessible to everyone. So whether it's the 15 or the 20-minute neighborhood, but the idea of ensuring that what we try and build back and create are communities where you've got access to most of the things that you need. We've proved that technology can deliver quite a lot of the rest of it, and certainly takes the pressure off those people who do need to continue to travel. So I think there's some nice thoughts to take away on that for me.
I found it really interesting listening to everyone's talks and hearing the common threads that were running through them. I think the need for change and the need to be proactive if we want change was what I'm taking away from this. So I like Richard's suggestion that I visit India. I've always wanted to go, so maybe I'll try and do that, but also try and take my ideas for my own street and see if I can make some baby steps towards maybe parts of that beginning to happen in my local area. And maybe I could challenge some of the rest of the audience to think about your own local streets and what steps you could take to maybe improve them a little bit, as well as doing great things out in your professional fields to improve our world. So thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Helen. Well, yeah, I'd just like to thank all our panelists for their contributions. And I think what I picked up was that we seem to have 5 key themes running throughout the discussion. So firstly, around hybridization, so multi-use spaces, and the fact that we're doing multiple activities in the same space. And this goes from rooms to buildings to streets to zones, and that kind of multifaceted use of across all geographical scales. Also, this tension between public and private in terms of health, transport, and other areas. There's that public-private tension feels to be writ large at the moment. And that kind of feeds into this idea of inequality. So inequality of access and inequality of exposure. So by ordering our shopping online, we might be reducing our exposure, but also the delivery people are increasing their exposure. And how do we reconcile that along with the ideas around digital exclusion, which is something that's been talked about for a long time, but is now really coming to the fore as we're trying to move a lot of things online and remotely. And the idea of no regrets options. So how many birds can we kill with one stone? Are there interventions that can tick off a positive impact on climate change, that can give us the kind of health benefits that we're looking for, and improve our quality of life at the same time? And so I think that's a good challenge for us. And also, similar to the public-private tension, I think there's this tension around institutions versus individuals when we're thinking about how to make change happen. You know, the corollary is with things like climate change. If Shell actually change something about their business model, it's likely to have a much greater effect on climate change than me deciding to use a bamboo toothbrush or my own personal individual actions. And I think that feeds through into these challenges for local authorities as facilitators and not providers, and looking at the kind of funding models and allocation and taxation of space. And it feels like there are lots of itties going on. There is accessibility, you know, inclusivity, flexibility. How do we roll all those elements up together? So finally, thank you very much everyone for your involvement. We're going to leave the meeting running in case any of you want to talk with each other, but I want to say farewell from us, and thanks again to all our panelists for your really useful and interesting contributions. So yeah, thank you for your time and for your intellectual contributions. It's been a really interesting conversation. Goodbye.